Thank you. Thanks very much, Sharon. Thank you for the chance to come and speak with you today. And of course, it's always lovely coming back here. And of course, a very special day as we celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Doherty, which I think was a fantastic experiment that's obviously proving to be very successful. It was a really special experience to be part of the creation of this institute, and of course partly being involved in building such a magnificent building, but also the whole concept which Jim described so eloquently before and reminded me of all of those elements that were brought together to create this very special place. I think also to have such an institute placed here in the heart of the Parkville precinct, of course, gives it just an extraordinary opportunity to not only to be extraordinary in the connections that are made within the institute, but also out into the wider clinical and research sector. So congratulations to everyone who's put that dream into practice over the remaining years since, certainly since I left more than 4 years ago. And of course, thank you to Peter for lending his name, for his mentorship and his guidance, as well as his presence here so often at the Institute. Now, my involvement with the Doherty was one of those career experiences that's really influenced how I think about Australian science and the opportunities that we have here, particularly to continue Australia's long tradition of outstanding research that breaks through conventional thinking to create new paradigms and to solve the problems of our world. Think how Burnett rebuilt the conceptual underpinnings of immunology with a clonal selection theory in the 1950s. Think about how in the 1970s, Peter and Rolf broke open that deep puzzle of T-cell antigen recognition. Or for that matter, how Barry Marshall and Robin Warren overturned long-held beliefs about gastric ulcers. If we think back more than half a century or a century ago, then it was clear that one of Australia's strengths actually came probably because it was a long way from the rest of the world. So people had to solve their own problems and they had the intellectual space to think differently. There was room for mavericks, there was room for iconoclasts. But perhaps this is one of the reasons that Australia was such a powerhouse then in infection and immunity. Today, I think, of course, in Australia, we're all well integrated into global science. We're linked by technology, we're linked by rapid travel. We don't have either the limitations or those possible benefits of being a little bit away from the rest of the world. But we still have smart people, and they've been enriched by migration and supported by institutions like this one. And so I think if we use those assets wisely, we'll continue to surprise the world and make a disproportionate contribution to solving the problems of humanity. And that, of course, takes me to funding. Now, money isn't the only thing that matters, but it does, of course, matter a bit. And as most people in this room know, we're living in a time of significant disruption to medical research funding in Australia. Now, I know some of that's my fault. But I'm not going to apologise for it, and I'm not responsible for all of the disruption that's happening at the moment in medical research funding. So I'd like to talk, of course, about NHMRC, and then, if there's time, say a few words about the MRFF, the Medical Research Future Fund. Now, NHMRC's new grant program that everybody is living today overthrows some of NHMRC's longest standing schemes. All those fellowship schemes that we used to have, there were 5 separate schemes, have been replaced by a single large valuable scheme that offers salaries and research support packages for outstanding researchers at all career stages. Now, these grants offer flexibility and certainty for 5 years. So I think for those outstanding people and extremely fortunate people who've won grants in the first round, they're really an amazing opportunity to think very strategically about how you use that research package, and particularly if it's one of the larger ones, it's like having a single person program grant. It's really an opportunity to take advantage of. They're precious, they're prestigious, and I doubt they're ever going to be actually easy to get. Now, program grants have been replaced by synergy grants, and that's effectively a collaboration booster grant with a very strong emphasis on pulling together diverse multidisciplinary teams to address those kind of more complex and expensive problems. Now, when we talk about diverse and multidisciplinary, we don't mean a T-cell immunologist working with a B-cell immunologist. So step outside your usual networks, do something special with these grants, and something you couldn't do on your own or with a traditional grant. And then project grants have been replaced by ideas grants, and these are seriously about the idea, the science, not the person, and therefore, of course, they're quite complementary to the investigator grants, which are very much about the person and track record based. So there are some important themes that run through the design of this new grant program, and these changes are really deliberate, and they aren't changes just for change's sake, even though it might be good to be shaken up from time to time. First of all, I think there's more than one way to do important high-quality research, and our funding structures need to reflect that. Big teams can be highly productive by bringing together lots of people and resources to tackle those really big multidisciplinary problems. But actually, some of the most innovative and groundbreaking research comes from small teams who think differently and take risks. So as a funder at NHMRC, we need to support teams of different scales and as far as possible give you the flexibility you need to decide how to be most effective with the resources you have. And then, of course, what that means for you as a researcher is that you have a very interesting question to ask. What are your strengths and how can you best use your resources to tackle significant questions and to do something really useful? So that's your part of the bargain, really. Now, the second thing people will say is that many people will think that the best predictor of future success is past success. And so it's reasonable to use track record as a parameter to reduce the risk that NHMRC takes in investing in you as a researcher, to reduce the risk that you'll actually be unproductive with that public investment. Now, most funders do this. They use track record as a risk reducer, and we at NHMRC have done that for a long time too. So track record's important for most of our schemes, and it's particularly important for investigator grants and synergy grants. So if we're going to give you a large, flexible 5-year grant, then it's reasonable, I think, for us to reduce the risk in that way. But on the other hand, past track record isn't necessarily a perfect predictor of future success. And so you can also argue that you need to take some risks if you're going to get big rewards. So the most important new research might come from an emerging researcher who doesn't yet have much of a track record at all, or it might come from somebody whose ideas aren't yet mainstream. It's a bit, I mean, Alan's been talking about the banks. It's a bit like investment in financial markets. If you're an investor and you want some really big wins, you'd probably take a risk on some startups rather than put all your money into established old businesses. So NHMRC, in designing this new grant program, is diversifying its portfolio and spreading its risks by investing some of its funding in people who've already shown great productivity or great promise, and some of the balance, which is 25% for ideas grants, in research which is not yet backed up by deep track records. A third theme that runs through the design of the new grant program is respect for the value of your time. Now, that might be hard to believe this year when we've been managing really huge numbers of applications to the new grant program, and as usual, that means there have been a lot that have already and will be not funded, and that's translated into a very big peer review load for the sector. So I think that's an inevitable consequence of people testing the new schemes, but it is hard to talk about the value of your time when we've drawn on it so much this year. But what we are trying to do is to achieve a reduction in the drivers for each individual to submit more and more applications to try to get some funding. In the old grant program, for example, fellows received a salary, and these were hard to get, but they then had to come back to us and submit other applications in order to get funding to support the research of their own research and their lab's research. If they're good enough to get a fellowship, why would we make them do that? In the old grant program, individuals could apply for and hold up to 6 project grants. Hardly anyone held more than 2 or 3, especially as the lead investigator of the CIA. So naturally, many people were trying to win more, but a very few of those were being successful. Now, some institutions were also encouraging people to submit applications regardless of their likelihood of success if they were applying for promotion. There are institutions who said if you're applying for promotion, you have to have active grant applications in the system. And at NHMRC, we were also encouraging grant applications by including the number of grants held in the track record assessment. So we'd rather you actually didn't spend your time writing applications with very little chance of success. So we're trying to eliminate those drivers for you to submit more and more applications by capping numbers across some of the schemes and by removing grants held as one of the criteria in track record assessment. So if you have an investigator grant or a couple of ideas grants from us in the future, and you really want to write more applications, then how about diversifying your funding sources and looking beyond NHMRC, thinking whether you think nationally or internationally, or think about using that extra time and energy to focus on your research. That's what we'd like to see. Now, another theme that you've probably noticed this year, and this goes way beyond NHMRC, and that's the increased focus on research impact, and Alan's also mentioned this. I think it's worth spending a few minutes on this because there's really much more to it than some annoying new boxes in the grant application forms. If I can give you a personal perspective, in the early years of my own research career, I didn't think at all about why the public or the government should invest in me or the research that I was doing. I can remember feeling incredibly lucky that I could have that kind of job, but I kind of accepted the idea, and I probably assumed that everybody else did as well, that the sort of basic research I was doing was somehow valuable for its own sake. Now, I haven't lost that belief in that value. I believe the value of fundamental research and discovery as one of the really important domains of human endeavour and as one of the essential activities of an intellectually advanced society. I personally can't think of anything more exciting than understanding the beautiful complexity of the immune system, or the evolutionary competition between virus and host, or the biological basis of human consciousness, even if we couldn't use that information to improve the human condition. But of course, I also know that fundamental research and discovery are the source of all the major technological developments and solutions to our problems. Now that I sit in a government agency and I try to see the world through the eyes of a Minister for Health, regardless of their political party, or for that matter through the eyes of the generic taxpayer whose money we're spending, I realise I can't assume that either of those types of people actually do see the intrinsic value of research, or that they'll necessarily understand that this is where the biggest advances come from. So I think all of us need to do more to make the case for this sort of work. Now that's partly a matter of storytelling, of course. If you compare an institute annual report from the 1980s, full of graphs and acronyms and grey-haired gentlemen in white coats, with the equivalent institute reports today, you'll see that we've all caught on to this, that we need to communicate research in a way that appeals to a broader audience, that the wider community can respond to, relate to, see themselves in, and will want to support it. But of course, the issue also goes beyond storytelling. Are we designing, executing, and communicating our research in a way that will actually lead to those great outcomes that we always promise in our grant applications? And are we collectively recognising and rewarding research that delivers those outcomes? In research, and this is really back to some themes that Alan has prosecuted so effectively this afternoon, in research, as in any other field, what you measure is what you get. If you reward people with grants or promotions by counting scientific publications, whether that's by the meter or by citations, then chances are you'll get more scientific papers. If, on the other hand, if you were to reward people by measuring the real impact of their research, then researchers would plan for impact and they would deliver impact. So that's why we've added past research impact to the track record assessment for investigator grants and synergy grants. It's because we want at NHMRC to recognise and reward you for the impact that you've already achieved, whether that's on knowledge, whether it's on health, whether it's on the economy, or whether it's on society. Think very broadly about what the impact is. It doesn't have to be that you can say that this patient's life was saved by your research. We also want you to encourage you to plan for impact in your future research. So if you get one of these grants, you come back in 4 or 5 years' time asking for more money. What are you going to tell us as the impact of the research that you've done over these years? Now, this also links clearly back to Alan's remarks, because it's critical that the incentives that we create through our funding and academic promotion systems are aligned with what we actually want to get as the product of these public investments in research and in the people who do the research. Poor quality publications, data that can't be understood or replicated won't change the world, or certainly not in a positive way. They won't add to knowledge, they won't lead to improvements in the length or the quality of our lives, and they won't solve our problems. If we shift the focus to actual societal impact of our research, and I really do mean that includes knowledge, then this will surely be reflected in the quality of the papers that we all write. So there's a lot going on at NHMRC, and I've just covered a few of the themes of what we're doing at the moment. But of course then there's the Medical Research Future Fund. And Duncan has pointed out very clearly that we now have 2 funds for health and medical research. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but that's the way it is, and there's a tremendous opportunity for us here. Now, the MRFF is getting close to its target of $20 billion. This is a phenomenal commitment from the Australian government. They have actually kept their word, and they've presented the research sector with a big, new, but different opportunity to get support for research that will improve the health of our community. Now, we somehow need to make this work. To do that, I think we have to understand what it's for. It's not the same as NHMRC. It's for priority-driven research to improve health and well-being of our country, and those priorities are determined by the government through the Minister for Health. The Minister is guided by an advisory board, which is in turn guided by a two-yearly public consultation with the community. And we all have the opportunity to have a say during that public consultation. You also, as a sector, have influence through the way you interact with the Minister and the Parliament. When you do so, it's important to see the world through their eyes and to think about how to encourage them to make the decisions that will deliver on the promise of the MRFF for the whole of the Australian community. If we don't want the government to make direct grants without peer review, we shouldn't lobby them to do just that. Let's lobby about the big issues, our national needs, and let's excite them with the opportunities that we have to solve our problems through research. If we want government to use peer review to allocate MRFF funding, let's praise them when they do. There's also an opportunity now for quite a number of people who are part of the expert advisory panels that are overseeing the MRFF missions, of which there are quite a number. Those of you who are involved in those panels have the chance to set the tone, establish the processes and programs that are going to have a real impact on the issue, whatever the issue is that's covered by that mission. So I think that for all of us at different levels, there are opportunities to try to make this work. Now, I may be living in utopia, but I do believe we can make it work, and in fact, I believe we can't afford not to. In conclusion then, this is a time of disruption, but disruption always brings new opportunities, and I hope that everyone will embrace those opportunities. I think here at the Doherty, you have the people, you have the facilities, you have the location, you have the connections. You have everything you need to embrace those opportunities and to succeed with them. So I wish you luck, and thank you for your attention. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Anne. Anne is happy to take a few questions. It's Graham Brown.
Thank you, Anne, for a wonderful presentation. Of course, over the years, we've all seen very different ways of managing NHMRC funds in the public interest, from blocks to programs to institutes. What have you measured now, and what will you measure in 5 years to say that this was worthwhile?
Thanks, Graham. And when you make changes like this, you have to be pretty clear what your goals are. And of course, we have lots of goals, but we identified 3 in particular which we articulated and which we must measure ourselves against over these coming years. And one was opportunities for outstanding researchers at all career stages and across all disciplines. And that really means to pay attention to the whole career span. And of course, we were particularly concerned about early and mid-career researchers. The second one, and really the hard one to evaluate progress on, is to foster innovation and creativity, because we were really worried about the pressures really driving conservatism And, well, you know, of course it drives more salami slicing and that sort of thing as well. But really, we were concerned about increasing conservatism in research when it's so hard to get money that people will only put up a safe project. We wanted to create a system that will give people more flexibility and really encourage some risk-taking, whether it's through the investigator grants, which are, you know, big one-liners, or whether they're through the ideas grants with the focus on the idea instead of the track record. So that's actually the hard one to measure. But we'll work on the various parameters that we can use to try to measure that. The third one was to reduce the burden on the sector of excessive application writing and peer review. And that's a hard one, as I've already said, to talk about this year because the application numbers were so high with the first year of the new grant program. But the way it's been designed, we believe and certainly hope that the numbers will come down as this system moves to steady state. And if you think of somebody who previously had a fellowship and had to write all these extra grants, if that person now has a single investigator grant with salary and package, then that's a whole lot of grants they're not writing, and that's, I hope, a whole lot of time for extra research. So there are various aspects of
the first two particularly, you didn't say how you were going to measure them.
Yeah,
the
so
third one you can ask the investigators if they have it.
Yeah, so Graham's asking, I haven't said how we will measure them. I think it's first very important to say what it is. And so those are the three objectives. And so we've got a lot of statistical analysis, of course, of the coverage of the sector by the new grant program. And nobody can really see that yet. We can't see it yet because we've only seen one big scheme announced for the first year. But there are a lot of things to measure there. The hard one is innovation and creativity. The third one is something we can also measure as well. But there are various ways you can look for multidisciplinarity, and there are various ways I think we'll be able to look for the quality of more freed up research.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's lots of questions for Anne who'll be around at the end. And we also have a gift for you, the incidental tourist from
Thank you.
Doherty. I hope you have not read that. A wonderful read.
Wonderful. I actually haven't got this one. I think I've got all the rest.
Thanks again for your leadership, and I think the changes of the NHMRC